I am happy to introduce our first featured poet of the night, John Challis, who lives and works in the Northeast. His debut collection, The Resurrectionists by Blood Axe in 2021, was a poetry book of the month in The Guardian and highly commended in the 2021 Forward Prizes for Poetry. His pamphlets include The Black Cab by Poetry Salzburg in 2017, a 2019 New Writing North regional title, and Whole Song by New Writing North in 2022, written while he was a writer in residence at the National Trust Seton Delaval Hall. His poetry has appeared on BBC Radio 3 and 4, in Poetry Ireland Review, Poetry London, The Poetry Review, The Telegraph, and elsewhere. He is the recipient of a Northern Writers Award, a Pushcart Prize, and an Authors Foundation grant from the Society of Authors. He's an editor for Poetry Salzburg Review and teaches at York St. John University. And John, we have a little tradition over here at Poetry Lit where I do a reflection beforehand. So I read your poems and I thought that this is a poetry of deep reaching roots, starting in modern or perhaps pre-modern life, because some poems gave me a firm Victorian vibe, but always ready to take you further down, to trace back to the beginning of things, before the first of us found the gift of fire, as you say in one of your poems. A poetry where things are fluid and changing, like a river that gives and takes, surges and shrinks. And above all, I think poetry that seeks to resurrect that which is not quite lost. Poetry that is at home with the dead, that digs and labors to bring something to life, something that is past as much as it is present. And I also always ask a question, and this time my question to you, John, is how can poetry change the way we see the world?
Gosh, thank you very much for that wonderful description of my work. I really appreciate it. It's always lovely to hear, what other people think, but how you encapsulated it so well there. So thank you. And so interestingly too, yeah, it's a really good question. And when I was sort of trying to think, how do I come at this, in a kind of encapsulated way, really? And I think, I kind of can only really speak personally how poetry has changed the world for me, and I think it has done so in many ways, really. I think firstly, I think poetry allows me to be part of something, and I don't just mean like a community of people. I think a community of language itself. I'm quite interested in the sense of that a poem becomes a place. It's a made place, it's a constructed place, a place made of language, of memory, observation, various different textures, but it's a sort of place, it's kind of a world in miniature, I suppose. And I get quite obsessed when I'm making poems and sort of sculpting them, and I really enjoy that kind of making part, and it helps me kind of focus. Actually, it helps me examine things and think about things in a way that I don't think I would do if I didn't write poetry. So yeah, for me, it's a sense of belonging, a sense of communion with history. I think, and with time and space, I think this sort of plays into a lot of the themes and the subjects I write about as well. But I also think it's not just about seeing; it's about hearing as well. I suppose poetry, it's an oral thing mainly. Words have sounds. Um, you know, so to me, it's about how I hear the world as well. And I think one thing I love when I'm writing a poem is to sort of experiment with those different kind of combinations of sentence and syntax and rhyme and echo. And I've only written one book really, so I'm still figuring all that out, and it's really exciting. But I think that's one of the things that really drives me to write poems is not only that sense of belonging, but that kind of play with word and sense, and how I can make something mean whilst also sound, kind of like it has a kind of sense of rapturousness, a rapturous speech, the oratory thing. And yeah, I mean, I could rattle on for a while.
Well, and I mean, I'm listening to you quite captivated, and also thinking how much sense what you say makes, having read your poems. So I'm like, yeah, I get what you mean. So with that, I would love to invite you to read some for us.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to start with a poem about the River Thames in London. Thames. After a day of keeping tugs and waste disposal barges, sailing races, showboats, and commuter clippers afloat, the Thames turns inwardly to find a space to stretch out in, within a space no bigger than itself, and burrows through the mud and clay where every London intersects to get its nose beneath the grave, then flips the past up like a coin to send afloat its drowned possessions, Anglo-Saxon ornaments, unexploded payloads, bone dice and oyster shells, wedding rings and number plates, and all those you might have been had your time started early. Gravediggers, barrow boys, mole men and cockle pickers, gong farmers and costermongers, resurrectionists and suicides, the taken, the lost, the given, then settles down to dream again of all its infant waterways, the estuaries and tributaries that led it here among the rusted hulls of years to where there is no space to breathe or settle down to sleep. So a lot of my poems, thank you. A lot of my poems are sort of set in London. It's the city, I grew up on the edge of London, but it's the city, I guess, of my birth, and where it seems a lot of my family, at least for, I don't know, a few generations anyway, from the East End of London. So a lot of the poems take part in that world, and they kind of connect with the jobs and the different things that members of the family, especially in the male line, did. But this next poem I want to read is kind of a, you know, I realized after I finished this book that there's so little of me in the book. There's so much about them, the dead, the family, the past, and there's a few poems, you know, from my perspective, and I wanted to read one of those now. This one's about encountering horses at a football match at West Ham United's old football ground, Upton Park. Horses in Upton Park. I hadn't expected horses, splendid in their yellow smocks and welders' visors. What they must have thought of us. They lived in stables or on scrap heaps by motorways. Stunted ones, peppered white, wearing ornately coloured saddles, bore the weight of children at primary school fetes. Deep down a country lane, a sudden swift galloping, blind to ambler or canine, comes. These were different. Police horses, sleek and obedient, strangers to fording polite streams under full moons. They must dream of acting as statues to anger. And why they still choose them over armored vehicles. The wildness of horses. How their hooves can crush a man's temple with a kick. How, when you're close enough and look into a horse's eye, a blacksmith is firing his forge. I'd reach to stroke a mane, but there is sudden news of an engagement with a way support. And when what seemed born to stillness moves, there's fear beyond language that sets itself amongst your bones as though someone's suddenly there in the back of your car, at the foot of your bed, rearing like a horse on its hind legs. And the terrible sound of braying penetrates and freezes, and the dark and wild stare becomes the night before the first of us found the gift of fire. There's several poems in this book about markets as well, and markets in London being these kind of, you know, interesting transactional sites of history, really, and the different purposes they serve throughout various centuries, but a lot of them were originally graveyards, and and that kind of idea of a kind of commerce and life and death kind of echoes throughout the book. But here's a kind of lighter tone poem now. This one's kind of reflections from my granddad, really. He worked in a market all his life selling fruit and veg after the war. And, he told me many interesting little nuggets and stories. So this poem kind of collects voices from the market. It has a quote from Brecht's play, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui at the start, which is a kind of a parable about the rise of Hitler, told through a story of the Chicago mob controlling fruit and veg. The cauliflower business in this town is down the drain. This is the market. Bundled first editions arrive. Comics released from West End clubs rehearse new material to labourers and foremen. Authority figures stride to cars from young men getting dressed in alleys. A bottle smashes, a cab bleeps. Laughter swells from opened cafe doors. I used to treat the children on Fridays. Fish wrapped up in the Evening Standard. Or trips to Clacton on Saturday mornings. Now I bring home the things I'm given. Boxes of shirts stacked in the hallway, our cupboards stocked with the premium tea. It was found in the street abandoned. It fell off the back of a lorry, came our way after the death of a long-lost Irish cousin. Money is found in the strangest places. The wheel arch of a delivery van, wrapped in a bag in a toilet cistern, under a copper's custodian helmet. Ownership is fluid. I'm going to read a couple more poems, obviously, but this is the final one of the London section of the reading. And this one takes as its subject the examination of the London black cab taxi driver, of which, my father was a taxi driver in London before he retired. And they kind of have to take this kind of epic 3-year kind of degree, really, in the city, learning everything there is to know about London in terms of how you get from A to B and different locations. And I kind of wrote this poem really as a sort of celebration of that examination and of the thing he did. The knowledge. Not the knowledge chosen for the national syllabus, nor knowledge scrawled by Mrs. Smith on the board in shaky chalk, but the knowledge I heard my father practice out loud after tea. Not a knowledge of capital cities, of England's football captains, David Beckham's scoring record, nor any pub quiz question, but a knowledge of maps, of London's maps in more than 3 dimensions. Maps that covered the dining room, a cheap print of the hay wain, of bubbles and of photographs, maps he rose each day to enter, a clipboard on his handlebars to expand his hippocampus. Manor House to Gibson Square, Archway to Gloucester Gate, Penn Street to Portland Place, Consort Road to MOD via Peckham Rye and Westminster Bridge. But I can't buy the wisdom that vocation is hereditary, that sons should live their lives to do the jobs their fathers did. Instead, I learnt not from the front, but from the back seat of his cab, ferrying decision makers, Canary Wharf to Portcullis House, past navvies tunnelling the underground, through the husk of blackout London, to here and now this argument. Taught to speak by 16 years of answering the register, by milk, chalk and cartridge ink, Shakespeare and the Lord's Prayer, I raise my arm to pay my coins, my tributes to the knowledge. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I really appreciate it. So this poem, to read now, is the title poem of the book, Resurrectionists. And obviously, many of you know the Resurrectionists was originally the term for Burke and Hare were you know from Edinburgh, with sort of two of the proponents of resurrectionism, which was the stealing of bodies from graves for medical science. And this poem, which gave the book the title, kind of is about kind of four ideas of resurrectionists. And one of them's a poet, one of them is someone who does steal bodies, who did sell bodies. One of them's a grave maker. One of them's kind of like a strange archivist, really, and one of them's a sort of detective. So they're all kind of different ideas of this idea of bringing something back for some reason. And they're in, you know, they're kind of written in those voices. So the I in this case is these different people. Resurrectionists 1. Some nights I leave out milk and bread. They arrive in silence, no fanfare of ice on breath, and take their place as though they've always sat there, weighing their words. They speak in turn, the rivers I failed to dredge, the fields of wheat hissing around a knife. I follow the crumbs they scatter on their way back to their deathbeds. I see if one will let me crawl into their grave. 2. You know the men whose business is to bring the dead to surgeons so that they may live again, jerking on the table at the dawn of electricity, convulsing for the benefit of students. I too feel the urge to make something out of nothing and profit from the work. The page, my barrow, and my charge, the word. 3. I hold the tally meter and count the dead as they arrive, thrown in through the doorway of the ground. I interview and catalogue. I note and name the battlefield, preserving with my rituals of bog, clay, and peat. I build a bibliography of bone. To comprehend the narrative, I taste the dirt that lingers in their mouths. 4. Because I do not plant or seed, you will not call me gardener, and yet I work to aid the spring. I give my days to cultivate the earth with lower homes. Though who would argue what I do applies a draftsman's artistry, but those like me who dig the holes, who prep and lay the bulbs. When someday I own a plot of all I gave my life to know, with every shoot and bud you find, remember, this is me still laboring below. And I'm just going to finish with one shorter poem now. Towards the end of the book, there's a sort of series of poems about the birth of my daughter. And naturally that kind of throws a bit of the living into the book. And again, you know, filtered through my own experience for a change as well, not just imagined or ancestral experience. And this poem is about feeding the child in a graveyard. Shade. And when she needed feeding, we fed her in graveyards on benches covered with lichen. Beneath palms and succulents, with a damp flannel, we cooled her head by the Metcalfs and Tregarthens, who, tired of tears and the damning of drivers, by the living Metcalfs and Tregarthens, stood cooing at the sight of our girl in a language we know as the breeze. And when she needed feeding again, we sat by the stone in the shade of the abbey, all the while our baby was sucking your breast that filled up like a cistern. The minute she stopped, the dead leaned in with their odor of milk, pursing their lips as though to kiss our baby's head, in the growing shade they bring with them. Thank you very much for listening. It's a pleasure to read. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.